It's Chelsea,
It's Nina,
and you're in the Critic's Kingdom.
Hey, Nina.
Hey, Chelsea. Today we are going to be talking about The Luck of the Irish, a personal favorite of mine for sure amongst the Disney Channel original movie canon. I have very fond memories of it growing up in my, youth in the inner city.
Oh, sorry, just love how you characterize that. I also really, really enjoyed this one because it has one Ryan Merriman, who was like king of the DComs in the he was the king of Smart House, and then he came and was on Luck of the Irish. Like he was that dude in
He
like
really
the late
was.
90s, early 2000s for any kid that was like a Disney kid.
Yeah, so should we just hop right on in to
Yes, let's
the
get
run through?
into the recap.
Okay, cool. So, let me just start off by making this very clear. The entire plot of this film, I believe, was taken directly from the very brilliant ad for a certain cereal with the hook that was "They're after me, Lucky Charms," because that is literally what happens. So, it starts off with this really intense kind of like voiceover over the images of like a Native American dance being performed in sort of full chieftain garb, which is slightly problematic. We can talk about that later. But Kyle, our main character, he's essentially telling us that, he doesn't really have a heritage. His family's never had one, his family's never talked about it. And it's just something that, I guess Heritage Day is coming up at school, and it's just not a part of his upbringing or his existence. He's just American, and his family's from Cleveland, somewhere in there. So we get to like see essentially some things are kind of we get to see how his life works, right? Like we see that he's really great at basketball, that he seems to be super lucky. He finds money all the time, and he can be spacing out and not paying any attention, circle all the answers to the test in the last minute and a half of class and get every single question right. But this whole Heritage Day situation, this girl at school, Bonnie, keeps coming up to him and asking him about his heritage. And, she's like, you're a really popular guy in school. Like, I think it's important for you to talk about who you are and showcase who you are for Heritage Day. So he starts to kind of investigate, who he is. He asks his parents, and his parents lie to him, like to his face, and they're so clearly keeping something from him that he starts to investigate on his own. And he finds out that he goes through his dad's stuff, realizes that his dad has a different name, that the name Johnson that they use isn't the one that he was born with. His dad's real name is Robert Smith. So like he's just very confused, and every time that he asks his parents, they're just not giving him any real information. But the one thing that they always tell him is that he has to keep wearing his lucky coin that he like has around his neck. So, before school one day, he like manages to touch the rim, which is super cool, and all this stuff. Like he's having the typical like great lucky morning, finds more money. His best friend Russell is like, yo, I really hate that this is what happens to you all the time. And as they're sort of like on their way to school, he sees a flyer for, I guess, this thing that sort of happens in the area pretty often called on the Saint of the Step. It's like a festival, an Irish festival. And because, Kyle is paying more attention now, he realizes, he's like, wait, that the image of the sun on this flyer is the exact same image that's on my lucky coin. And he's like, oh, like, wait, maybe I'm Irish. Like, I always thought that it was, again, very random and unnecessary. He's like, I always thought that it was some Chinese symbol. Doesn't look Chinese. No reason why you would think that. But he decides to, go to the festival, he and Russell. And when they're there, they like meet this one old dude who's like kind of weird and kind of chastises them about, wearing Nikes instead of making their own shoes. And he's just got a super weird vibe. But also while they're there, Kyle like ends up just naturally starting to, river dance when the other people are river dancing and performing on stage. And and then we watch him sort of get like hit and knocked down. And then, like he's picked back up and all this stuff. And he kind of goes about his business, right? And he's like, oh, that's cool. Like, it's cool to think that I might be Irish, and I'm like gonna ask my parents about it. So next morning we wake up and Kyle is having a deeply, deeply unlucky day. Which is very strange. And he wakes up and his mom is also acting totally different. Suddenly, her hair is down and she usually cooks all of this like healthy food. And suddenly she's making like blood sausage and like sort of a full Irish breakfast in the morning. And she's speaking with her accent, and he's starting to like speak with an accent that he's never had before. So he's really like confused about it, but he kind of like continues to go about his day. Again, like still super unlucky. He's like getting, he misses all of his shots in basketball practice, and he ends up like not playing very well in the game, almost costing them a chance to play in the championship. And everyone is like turning on him at school because like none of those children are loyal except for Russell. Russell is just like, dude, sometimes everybody has bad luck. And Bonnie is like, yeah, like just because for the first time in your life everything's not coming super easy to you, like doesn't mean that like you should be as upset as you are. Which, we can get into that a little bit later too. But essentially the next morning, like he wakes up and he realizes like not only is he playing horribly and all this stuff, but he's physically getting shorter. And his mom like is now a leprechaun, which is for any 13-year-old child, I'm sure, a very shocking experience. He doesn't inherently actually, all things considered, he takes it fairly well. But he's still very upset. He's like, why didn't you guys tell me? His dad essentially is like, your mom married outside of the leprechaun, I don't know, what do you call that? Like creatures? Whatever. She married outside of the leprechaun race, and like her family had a problem with that. So we moved and we changed our names, and we don't really know what's going on, but something's up clearly, because as long as you have your lucky coin, you guys should be able to pass for human. And he's like, wait, mom and dad, I have something to tell you. I think that my lucky coin's been stolen, because you always said this was pure gold. And in science class, like a magnet is attracted to his coin, which means that's actually iron. And their first conclusion is that he tells them essentially about his day. He tells them that he went to Saint of the Step, and they're like, we told you never to do that. It's like, sorry, you didn't talk to me about who I was, so I went to find out. And when they're going through what happened, she's like, wait, that old man that came up to you, did he have a snake on the sole of his shoe? And he's like, yeah. And she's like, oh, that's your grandfather. He must have stolen your necklace to try to teach us all a lesson. So they go, his grandfather happens to run like the huge potato chip factory. And so they go to the potato chip factory, and through a series of, a series of events, a comedy of errors of sorts. Bonnie happens to be on a field trip there, and Kyle sneaks in like with the group that is the field trip of middle school children. He and Bonnie end up sort of like being seen by security, because their grandfather doesn't want to let him into the place, so security starts chasing them around. There's a whole very long chase scene through a factory, which is deeply unsafe. But it essentially ends with him like running into his grandfather, and his grandfather being like, why would I steal your lucky coin? It's the luck of the whole clan. That don't make no sense. I didn't do it. And when Kyle breaks down what happens again, he's like, of course I know what happened. It was definitely that dude Seamus, like the guy who runs the Saints of the Step. He's horrible. He's like a fair Derek, and he's terrible. He's like an evil leprechaun. So they all get together, and now like, his parents and his grandfather, they haven't fully reconciled, but they have to like kind of be civil to each other. And deal with each other to try and get the luck of the clan back, because that lucky coin is the luck of the entire clan O'Reilly, and it's always worn and borne by the youngest, which is why Kyle has been wearing it all this time, even though don't trust a 13-year-old with your clan's entire luck. That should be obvious. So again, like more hijinks ensue. They happen to run into Russell, so Russell joins the gang as they all go off in search of Seamus. They have a lot of bad luck because again, like the clan's luck is gone. They end up chasing a rainbow to its end and find, a pot of gold, find the lucky coin. And Seamus is not having any of this. And Kyle decides to make a bet with him. He bets him that he can beat him at sports. Now, if he can beat him at sports, then he has to have his clan's luck back. He has to give him the lucky coin. So they do sports. Seamus is, shifty. So he does sports that are traditional ancient Irish sports that, some Kyle is able to do, others he is not. It doesn't make sense why a 13-year-old who regularly plays basketball can't outrun like a 40-year-old man, but we're going to let that be. But essentially what happens is that they tie. And Seamus is like, well, you didn't beat me, so I don't have to give you anything back. And Kyle decides, you know what? I'm going to make a final bet with you for, all of the luck. And, if I win, you have to live forever in the land of my fathers, et cetera, et cetera. And he's like, okay, fine, cool. You're going to be my slave forever if you lose, and I get all your luck. What's the harm? So they play a game of basketball, essentially. And it's the championship game that his team just made it to. And they're playing this game. And at first, it's not working out too great. But then, his grandfather throws a coin at Russell, who's also on the team, and is like, hey, this is a lucky coin. You should, you can have some luck too. And then Russell starts playing really well. And Kyle sort of gets to a place where he's like, you know what? The luck of the Irish, it's inside me. So he starts playing really well. And essentially just through a system of, believing in oneself, trusting in one's, family, partners, friends, they're able to actually defeat Seamus. And at first Seamus thinks it's fine, whatever. He's like, yo, I'm just going to go to Ireland and live with all my luck. And and Kyla's like, dude, I told you land of my fathers. My daddy is from Cleveland. The lake is pronounced Erie. Peace out. And there's a fun little moment as we watch this grown man shrink into a little leprechaun. And his hair goes red and all this fun stuff. And then he shoots off into the air and, he's living on the shores forever. Whereas Kyle then, we see a little bit later, it's Heritage Day and he's performing a river dance in his Cleveland brown shirt. And, essentially all of these characters have just learned in various ways to fully embrace themselves and that, sometimes you make your own luck in this world. And that is the luck of the Irish.
Cool. So with that, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with the review.
So go ahead.
So to get into the review, I feel like this movie is one of those classic ones that everybody in our general age has seen and saw multiple times. Because as I said before, Ryan Merriman was literally the Disney go-to for a long time in the early 2000s, late 90s. But I think this movie brings up a lot of interesting points. I think one of the ones that we talked about specifically was the intense nationalism and patriotism, but how it differs from what we see in Alley Cat Strike, which you all know was our favorite movie.
That was so disappointing. Watching that was so disappointing. I had loved it so much as a child.
But yes, this one differed in a variety of ways, but also very much drilled the patriotism home still. Just in, some of the things that people were saying, his mom being we're Americans, we don't need to know where we're from.
That is our heritage. It's Cleveland. It's but that's not.
That's the only heritage we need is that we're American. And then Bonnie later says she says something about we're individuals or something like that, or maybe his dad says that like that being an American is all about being an individual. Um, which is true actually. They were right on the money on that one. I think Bonnie later says like I'm American and Americans don't give up. Like it's very much a I don't it feels like that we can do it poster.
That's a fair way to put it. Like that's fair. I think the the way that what I took away though was that it is so deeply nationalistic, and there's an inherent problem with the concept of nationalism as we have watched it played out on the world scale in the last century. It can lead to a lot of not great shit. But I think that where this deep, like the way in which this very much differs from Alley Cat Strike, is that like if we're gonna do a version of American nationalism, I would want it to be this one. Like, because in this one, it's kind of a thing of what keeps being reiterated to Kyle is essentially that like, and his parents have to learn this lesson too. Like, you can't run from your past. You can't ignore your past. You shouldn't ignore your past. You shouldn't choose to forget the things that made you who you are, even if some of them are steeped in pain, right? Because like that's the whole thing about like his parents don't want they're afraid of what her family might do, or they don't want to deal with the pain that her family feels about her choosing to marry outside of the leprechaun race, right? So there's like that, but there's also just this larger thing of Bonnie is actually the one who says it a bunch of times, where she's like, everybody comes from somewhere else in this country. No one is from here.
Besides
obviously,
the natives.
it's besides the Native Americans, and we can, like guys, we get into that in a second because that one, like, they even have Russell do the thing where he's like, "I'm part Cherokee," and I cringed inside. I was like, "Oh no!" But yeah, like just this idea of that is something to be embraced. It's not something to be ashamed of or to shun. That is actually what makes us unique. It is what makes us like a nation of peoples who have this sense of building their own luck and this sense of perseverance and determination, and like wanting to quote unquote make it no matter what. Now, the fact that that is often at sacrifice of the larger clan is kind of problematic, but I do think that this movie does a good job of like walking that line and showing how like Kyle needs both knowledge of the clan and knowledge outside of the clan in order to triumph. So yeah, it's interesting because I by default shy away from things that are super American, just because it makes me worry. But I think this is an example of it had at least moving in the right general direction.
Yeah, I feel that. And I think, like you said, it's like it's always complicated because especially when anytime, like you said, that you get too patriotic or too much nationalism, it's scary. And I think especially with all the events we've seen this year, we've kind of seen the breaking points of that.
Yeah.
So it's like watching this in the year 2021 is already a very different experience than when it came out in 2001, which was already a very different experience. So I want to say it came out before September 11th.
I feel like it had to. It was probably a March release. We should look that up.
We should.
But
Hold
it's
on. Yeah, it was March. It came out
Yeah,
for
I would
probably
assume,
St. Patrick's Day.
yeah.
But yeah, so it was a March release. So it's like a very yeah, it's a very interesting film. It's like looking back and then also looking at the year it came out when things changed like a couple months after this film actually came out in terms of nationalism and American patriotism and just America and the world in general.
Which is a very, I didn't think about when we were watching it, sort of at the end they sing "This Land Is Your Land."
Yeah.
And it's you saying that just now, it sort of puts this lens on it. I never considered the fact that like, there is a very good chance that the reason that I and you and like all like there are multiple reasons why this would have been played a lot. But I do think that like post 9/11, this was probably played very, very often on Disney Channel.
Yeah.
And I do like I remember learning that song for the first like or hearing that song for the first time watching this film and loving that. And being from New York, like going through 9/11, it did create this like one of my favorite CDs in my house is still like this like American patriotic like ballad collection, which these were all very popular. But
Yeah,
for
I have
some
one of
like I don't
those.
know, I've always associated this film like with that CD,
Mm-hmm.
because of like that song. And so there's definitely a like it's just an interesting. It came out at a very interesting time, and then I think later on played a very interesting role, probably in
Yeah.
sort of the shaping of what it means to be American for 10-year-olds or
Yeah.
9-year-olds who are watching television and trying to deal with like tragedy, or even if they didn't understand it, like watching their parents deal with tragedy and their teachers and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, I definitely think it ended up serving much more of a bigger point than probably Disney ever intended. They were probably like, "Oh, this is going to be a fun movie for St. Patrick's Day."
Yeah.
And that was just what it was going to be. And then, other things happened later that year. But yeah, I think even to go in on the Irish point specifically, because a lot of it, they do talk about how hard it was when they moved to the country, and um, how Irish folks were treated very differently from a lot of people, which I'm sure most of our audience knows, like the story of the Irish in America and how they were very much basically considered like right above Black people, and then Jewish folks, like that,
like
that was
after a
basic.
minute, at first they were right in the trenches with the rest of us. They really were. And then through processes of creating whiteness, they were elevated barely. They were like, you can be firemen and cops,
Yeah,
but
but I still don't
we
think they were
still
never, and I think that's again where it gets a little, it always gets complicated because it's like there isn't an oppression Olympics, but I do think in this country, even when they first came here, they were still not at the same level as African Americans.
yeah. And I mean,
They were very
there's a
much
great little
like I
moment.
said, I think there was the hierarchy. They were very much at the bottom of said hierarchy, but they weren't at the bottom of the bottom hierarchy. So it's like they were very very they were treated horribly. I think everybody knows that. Like it was really bad. But
Yeah, but there's a
they do
great little
talk
line
about
in
that
it
quite a lot
where,
in the film
sorry.
as well, and how that's like a big thing, and how they don't want to go back through that, which was interesting because I was just like, wait, but he's living in like 2001, like he's not. But anyway,
Yeah,
like
because they do a weird lens of like they add, and I mean this is a whole thing, and just on that, I will say that they do a weird nod to it. Like I don't know who it was in the writers, which of the writers was like, we should make note of like first of all the choice of Kyle having a Black best friend. I mean, like yeah, like Token, but like all of the people in his lives are people of color. And I guess if you're making a movie about immigrants, like fair enough, but still.
yeah, it was very much on choice, on purpose, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
and it's like and when they're all talking about like how hard, or when his parents and his grandfather are trying to explain to Kyle like how horrible it was to be Irish in America, like there's a little moment where Russell is like, where it's like no Irish need apply, or like we got paid horribly for like the jobs we would do, and Russell is like, at least y'all got paid.
Right.
Like there's this weird little like recognition of that history that happens in it. So I mean, I don't know. It's a film that strangely feels like they were putting in work, though at the
Yeah.
same time. And I think that this like even like as you were saying this whole thing of like yeah it's 2001 though, like he's not being persecuted because of his Irishness in middle America per se. Like that's just
That's not what
probably
was happening for him.
not with at least like if they're close enough to Cleveland, like that's just not what that is. Like there are whole cities now that are predominantly Irish descendants. But like it's like what they add onto it, and we can sort of get into this because I know we mentioned it as we were watching it. Is like there's this element of like what's really other about them is that they're leprechauns,
Right.
and they're going to be discriminated against because of their leprechaun nature and the fact that they're little people, and that is part of this thing that seems to happen with, like, if I'm going to call out the other sort of truly identity films or like heritage films that I can think of that we've done so far, it's really like Wendy Wu, Buffalo Dreams. Correct me if I'm missing one.
No, I think thus far that's all we've really. I mean, I guess you could consider Color of Friendship to a degree, but they don't really get into like what Piper Dellum's like. They don't go into
Yeah,
like what's
and
her
it's
background as being African American, like where their family, like it's not
yeah,
about
and
that.
it's
So it's a little bit
purely it's
different.
kind of purely political. Like it's
Yeah,
purely
it's a
painted in a
different sort
political
of
realm. It's
thing.
not like a child's it's a different type of search. It's not an identity search.
Right.
It's a like morality search.
Mm-hmm.
And like yeah, and then there are other films that like are about predominantly minority characters, but like they're not about heritage per se.
Right.
You can kind of do that with Gotta Kick It Up, I guess, if you want to, but like again, based on a real story, seems a lot like it's has a lot to do with class and the way that like race makes class play out kind of situation. Anyway, the point being, it's like in all three of those films, like this one, Buffalo Dreams, Wendy Wu, Homecoming Warrior, it's interesting that they do this thing where the search for heritage and a heritage that is outside of Anglo-Saxon white is shrouded in like mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, and I get like it's fun and all that, but it's like, Wendy Wu can't just be like a second generation immigrant, like, or second generation immigrant American child. She has to be like part of this like great mythic story, and in Buffalo Dreams, it's like they have to go on this like mythic quest, and he is literally a magical creature.
Right.
Whereas like I'm sure like I can think of other Disney Channels or movies where like the character is finding a magical creature. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm,
like it's not an actual magical creature themselves. So I don't know. I don't know if there's much I can say about that, but it's just an interesting like thought topic, I think.
Well, because I think for a lot of people they can't or maybe it is that Disney thinks people won't be able to understand other cultures without us and without you invoking some sort of fantasy element, which then gets into the idea of like, do you think these people are fantastical? which is not a good place to be. Because they very much exist. But yeah, and we talked about that, I know, especially at length in Wendy Wu. And I think what we also got into there, and even somewhat with Buffalo Dreams. So Buffalo Dreams is obviously a different thing because they're they're Native Americans. Is just the idea that his mother also didn't even like his parents never told him. We also briefly got into this with Halloween Town with like Marnie's birthright to know she was a witch. And again, I ask, why? You like what? Like the leprechaun thing? Sure, maybe if you want to say they don't need to know that, but I'm like, why are we hiding that the boy was first generation Irish, right? Because the mom was.
I guess second.
The mom came over.
Because
she was supposed to have an accent, so I feel like she was supposed to have been like, because she wouldn't have had that accent had she been like born and raised here. Was like
that's true. Oh, but you know what it is? Like leprechauns live super long. Because I was also about to say, I was like, also like how old she is. Like it doesn't track that she would
have come over.
She wasn't cooking in an open fire in the
in the peat.
Like she's not that old, but they do make it very clear that like leprechauns live very long lives.
Right.
So there's logic there where it's like actually maybe she's like 105.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's the whole thing.
But yeah, she did a similar thing to what happened with Wendy Wu's parents, and their parents, her parents' parents, that they didn't teach them anything about being Chinese or speaking Mandarin. And then in this one, it's that she never taught him about being Irish, and in fact it literally says what I said earlier where she's like, America is the only heritage you need, Like it's very
Yeah.
much trying to erase a past, which I think is just interesting because he grew up in a different time where that wasn't necessary. Like when he was growing, he was born in what? If he's like 14 in 2001, he was probably born in like the late 80s or the early 80s.
Yeah.
So I'm like, it wasn't a time where
Late
people were
80s.
like still hating on the Irish to the point where like you want to erase the heritage. um,
Well,
so
I
it
mean, I guess like the trauma of it,
yeah, right.
you know.
It clearly carried over, but I just think it's an interesting thing because it does happen with a lot of that happens with a lot of or happened with a lot of immigrant children. You know, like that's a very unfortunately common thing that a lot of parents do because they feel like they need to assimilate, which is a real thing, especially if you're a person of color in this country.
Yeah.
um which I feel like has only really been like an acceptable thing honestly in the past like 10 or so years. Where it's suddenly being like, yes, we love everybody. Quote unquote love. But
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, sorry, go ahead.
No,
I
that was my point.
I mean, I find it interesting like that these movies start coming out when they do, especially considering the ones that are coming out like sort of before 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we've kind of brought this up a little bit before about how maybe like post 9/11 there actually is a reverting to
Yeah, there definitely was.
something that like the older thought sort of post 9/11, but like before there was this time period like I guess sort of in like the like mid 90s or like the early 90s to like just in the 90s, let's just call it the 90s, sort of turn of the century, where like that narrative was starting to be questioned, and we can see it in the film. And I don't know if that could have, it probably does have, I would imagine, a lot to do with the coinciding of you know, I know in particularly in a black lens, but there was a lot of black television out,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, there was.
So like just maybe this level of access that writers of from different places, or not from different places, but from different backgrounds, right? With different histories of how they are American, like are allowed to sort of tell their stories or are the ones writing stories. And so they're maybe infusing it with more of the like, oh, like maybe we should stop trying to do that. Like stop trying to make everything fit into a bubble. Stop trying to make everything in some version of American that isn't cohesive and or you know fundamentally true, or fundamentally prolific. And so we start to see that in like these kinds of movies, but then you know 9/11 happens, the war on terror happens, and America sort of reverts back
Mm-hmm.
to a much more, I would argue, dangerous way of thinking, an isolationist way of thinking that kind of brings us to where we are now, where it's like the kids who like grew up watching that sort of initial opening of the door, of like you can be exactly as you are and that's fine and that's good. Like they're older now and they're like, we want that back. Like we
Mm-hmm.
think that that was right, but it's coupled by people who were raised in fear, and who were raised to fear everything different because look at what different has done to us, sort of thing, you know.
Mm-hmm. No,
So I like,
I agree.
yeah, this film exists in a weird cusp.
Yeah, and I feel like that's, I mean, I feel like anybody listening, that's probably what you'll get is that it's a very, this one's kind of a hard one to define and to have a hard line about because of when it came out, because of what it's about, and because what they're trying to say was actually not a complete bumbling attempt. So it definitely is like a little bit of a, it's a hard one to parse through, I think. In regards to that, I think one thing I did enjoy about it, and what I enjoy generally about Disney's cultural films typically, is this one especially though they had a lot of food related stuff, and I feel like that was very interesting because typically that's how a lot of people experience different cultures. Because if you don't have access to go anywhere, you know, or to go somewhere, you can always go to like the restaurant down the street, you know, and try whatever it is. And food tends to be the easiest way to understand, or at least begin to understand people. So I did enjoy that they like mentioned a lot of the food stuff, like when his mom packed his lunch after she was beginning to revert to a leprechaun, and she was like, "I got you coal cannon and oh gosh, what was the other thing called? It was like was it? It wasn't. It was pig feet, I think, but I forgot what she called them. Gabine, Gabine. That's what it was. Coal cannon and Gabine, and then they threw them corned beef. They threw beef and cabbage. Seamus threw corned beef and cabbage um at Kyle and his family when they were chasing after them.
Which I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just have to say that was a I remember being a kid and that was a huge moment for me because as far as I knew, like white people knew nothing about corned beef and cabbage and it was a Jamaican thing, like just a Jamaican thing. And it was a very eye-opening moment for me. Like it happens to be that with the Irish in particular, there are quite a lot of things that culinary wise they happen to share like with Jamaicans. I'm sure that is entirely because of the British, but I just have to like it was. I just remember being like how old I was, like 8, and being like, oh my goodness, corned beef and cabbage. I thought like only like me and my family knew what that was. This is incredible. So yeah, the food was excellent on point.
Yeah, no, the food part was very fun. So I think with that, Nina, do you think you would show this to the babes, the bibes?
I mean, probably it's not a harmful film. Like, there's nothing like, and let me be clear, I still enjoyed it. It still has like a gaggle of laughs. Like, honest to God, truth, every time that they start playing that bagpipe, because they really choose the most like
And the flute.
inopportune moments.
The flute. They play that flute whenever it's just like they're
and
just
his
feeling the
grandpa.
spirit.
And his grandfather was like, yeah, he's like, I'm Irish. This is how I express my misery, which is, a stereotype and like not okay, but like just the utilization of certain, because there's a point where he's playing the flute and then they cut away and we show him playing the flute and then they cut back to Kyle and Kyle is river dancing with his red hair and leprechaun ears. And you're like, I don't like this is this is a very like entertaining moment. I understand Bonnie being like, we don't really have time for any of this. So it still has its little, it has its little gaggles of laughs that I think kids would still find very funny. I think that it's an interesting sports film because it's a sports film that's not about sports. And like even when they do things where like who isn't allowed to play sports, like Bonnie isn't allowed to play basketball, but it's not because of her gender, it's because her parents are like, I need you to focus on school and nothing else, I think that it has a like I said sort of earlier, this idea of, making your own luck or like things being inside of you that like it's okay to search with, like, you don't always have to search without to find something, you can search within. I think I've mentioned on this podcast a few times how like I think that that's just an important thing for kids to understand. I don't think that it's the end all be all. I think sometimes you need to look as much with like outside of yourself as you do look inside of yourself and around you. I think that you need to, always be willing to broaden your horizons. But I think that you also have to be secure with who you are and love who you are and trust in who you are and believe that you are capable, and believe that if you, keep working hard and doing the things that you love, that you will make something good of them. And I think that this is a story where like the main character learns that, and he learns it in a kind of fun way. The idea that his grandfather like invented the potato chip is like really fun, and it's something that like I could watch with my kids, and it's not going to be one of the most important movies in our household, but it's a fun day. We throw on some popcorn and we watch Look of the Irish, or around St. Patty's Day, and I explained that this has nothing to do with St. Patrick,
Literally
really at all,
nothing to
do with it. But like I don't know, like
which is I think the funniest part.
Exactly, absolutely nothing to do with it at all. They don't even make the Saint of the Step Festival a St. Patrick's Day's festival. Like it's not even.
It's so true.
It's so strange, but And also St. Patrick's Day like isn't like that big of a deal in Ireland either. Like it's just a
I was about to say
it's
that. I'm like, I don't
problematic for
think they
multiple
take it
reasons.
that seriously. We literally
They
just took
really
it
don't.
and did what we do, which is bastardize everything.
Well, I mean, I imagine that maybe it was the Irish attempting to like, it's kind of like maybe it's like the way that Kwanzaa was created. It's an attempt to like solidify identity in a place that tells you that you're not allowed to have one or that you're not a person. But yeah, still, still, like,
we did the same thing we
it's
did with Italian food. They also tried.
exactly. Yeah, we're just like now people just use it as an excuse to get drunk, and that's like fucked up. That's like not okay.
It's like it's
like you
it's
can't
a
reduce
Saints
people's
holiday. It's
culture
not
to that.
Santa Con.
Although
but-
Santa is technically a like Saint Nicholas. Whatever.
Not
Anyway,
here.
the point is
Not here.
never in America. The point is, yes, I'd show it to my kids. And yeah, I'd show it to my kids.
Yeah,
Chelsea?
I would agree. It's a fun one, and like we said, it has nothing to do with St. Patrick's, but it's a fun one to play then. Yeah, I mean, I do think like it's like you said, it's not inherently super problematic. It's literally just one of those things that it's like I feel like you would have to talk to them and be like, okay, but like also at the same time, you can't be you can't be like taking this to the extreme. But also you're gonna know your heritage, so you should not be having these basic questions won't be a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think it's still a fun one. I think it's one kids would still enjoy because, like you said, it is a basketball film without it being a basketball film. And yeah, I feel like it's still a fun one. I would definitely show it to my kids. It definitely wouldn't be like on the top of the like must watch list, but it's still fun, like you said.
Yeah. So I think with that, we will catch you guys next week.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of The Critics Kingdom. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and SoundCloud so you can stay up to date, as well as interacting and letting us know what you guys think on social media. You can find us on Twitter at Critics Kingdom and on Instagram at The Critics Kingdom. We're excited to talk to you again next week.